Good evening, good morning or good day, whatever it is when you receive this little message. And it's about the idea that has been propagated that the white Australian policy, and there was also at the same time a white American policy, was racist. In a sense it may have been, but since racism at that time, at this beginning of the 20th century, was basically a universal phenomenon, and most people were patriotically racist, depending on how they perceived their own, where they were with their own culture against the rest of the world. It didn't matter whether it was Chinese, Japanese, or Dutch, or German, or British, or whatever, or Turkish. They all saw themselves as patriotically inculturated with the people they were born amongst and lived amongst. So no particular race is totally not guilty of some form of feeling of racial superiority. Now, when Australia decided to have a white policy for immigrants only, they did it for a very particular reason at that time, which seems to be ignored by most historians, or they've missed the point. At that time, when there was a gold rush and people were coming into this country freely, if the government just after Federation had not taken the steps it had and had this white Australia policy and allowed millions of Chinese to come unrestricted into this colony, then it wouldn't have been long at all before the white people here would have been a minority in this country. And as it turned out, with the Chinese becoming communist and going through all its communist revolution, then having its big war with Japan, then Japanese involved in the American war, with a big war with America in the Second World War, Australia would become, one, chances are the Chinese would have just overpopulated the place of Australia, and during that time Australians and white Australians may even, because of the small amount of only about 5 or 6 million, may have had to have been somehow evacuated out of this country, given the overwhelming numbers of Asian people, which would have been a fight between the Japanese and Chinese over this country, which would have been very, very hard for America or Britain or Australia to actually deal with, given the extent of the World War at that time. Would have been the economic impacts of having to deal with all that, would have made it very, very difficult to deal with the economic and strategic and logistical needs to deal with a Japanese war within themselves and over this land of Australia, which they would have been, the Japanese were already contemplating taking it over. So that was one of the scenarios that would have occurred if there hadn't been a white Australia policy. Now, whether it's racist or not, really it wasn't at that time. The people who made that decision to have that policy, they knew very well what the Chinese, they would have had the intelligence on the ground in China to listen to what they were saying, and they would have been warned and known that the Chinese, and Chinese would have come here in ever more masses. There would have been more Chinese than these white people. And this is nothing against the Chinese, because Chinese are just like everyone else, want to expand their empire. They want to dominate wherever they are and do their own Chinese thing, which is all very good, because I welcome the Chinese into Australia very, very much so. And now, because it's done now, it'll happen when they come in, and it puts more even keel, and they'll bring the brilliance of the Chinese way of doing things, pragmatically way of doing things, to this country. So it won't do it any harm now, because we've got a democracy established, so what, even though the government's very poor here at the moment and hardly actually democratic in a true sense. And they hardly actually support free speech, and in fact the Chinese at this time in place maybe have more free speech of a practical kind than Australians, whose speech is limited by the universities, who said, well, science has to be orthodox and no new science can happen because we say there's limits on this understanding of that, limits on that. So there's actually the more like religious institutions in Australia. So things have come full circle. Australia's regressing. China was stable and stationary basically for 1,000 years in a way. It had its breakdown, end of the emperor, had its attempt at democracy, had its communism thing with the Japanese. Now it's came and really got into evolving its society in a most amazing fashion. So things have changed, and anything Chinese coming in now will be a great benefit to Australia, whereas before it would have been a total catastrophe for the white people in this nation. So although we may have seen racism at the racist, it's seen in hindsight as racist by the academics and the left and all the white people were racist. No, they weren't. They're not like, no different to any other culture on earth. Just people looking after their own. That's all it was. To have this rather naive and ideological view, and it's created within the universities and the media about the white people 100 years ago were racist because they had a white Australia policy, is absolutely rubbish, and it shows how little research or thinking or philosophical conversation goes on within the walls of universities these days. It's so shallow there, and why everyone bothers to pay a fee to go to these places, these brainwashing establishments, is a wonder to me. Anyway, there you are. It wasn't racism so much, but protectionism of a very, very new nation of people. And you think the massive Chinese would have too much pity on the white people here if there'd been enough of them at that time, during its communist revolution and all that? Well, I don't know about that. Difficult one to work that out, but the scenario of the Japanese and Chinese war involving the control of this country would have probably meant that the white people here may end up in the internment camps in the country, or sent to different parts, America, Canada, but different parts of the British Empire, Africa, places like that. But that's why we should be proud of what they did 100 years ago at Federation, when they had the White Australia policy, because then it's allowed this country of Australia to develop the way it has and have the values it has, that so all people come from now who come here will adapt to these values as much as possible if we set good examples of behaviour. Thank you. This is no one in particular having a point of view about the White Australia policy that everyone so far, as I can see, is basically lying about. Why? Because all white men are all racist, we know that, but all other old men are not. Odd that, isn't it?